Dear panelists and attendees, I would first like to thank you for being present at this panel discussion today. I am Artyom Tonoyan, Executive Chair of the All-Armenian Student Association, and I will be moderating today's discussion. This event, titled Artsakh and Armenia, Cultural Genocide, Memory, and the Shadow of History, is part of All-ASA's Artsakh Awareness Month, which we officially codified along with our constituent organizations and ASAs at our convention last month. Artsakh Awareness Month events like this are critical for both raising awareness about Artsakh and educating ourselves better as Armenians and global citizens. In these trying and rapidly changing times, it is doubly important to be knowledgeable and well-informed about the enormous threats facing our homeland and our people. We are, I think, constantly inundated with disinformation and alarming news, and this hostile environment contributes to a sense of malaise and worry about ourselves and our place in the world. But despite our physical distance from the homeland and this dread about our collective future, we must always seek to be active and engaged with the processes taking place in Armenia and Artsakh. We must know our history in order to be prepared to defend it and build a prosperous, dignified future. Our unique heritage as Armenians binds us and means that we all have a responsibility to do our part to help the cause. With that said, dear speakers and guests, I would like to now introduce our wonderful panelists. After each introduction, each panelist will have an opportunity to share some opening remarks. So first off, we have Dr. Artyom Tonoyan. He is a historian, sociologist, and writer specializing in the study of religion and nationalism in the South Caucasus and the Artsakh conflict. He is a visiting professor of global studies at Minnesota's renowned Hamline University. He has also served as a research associate at the University of Minnesota's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. His articles have been featured in several academic journals, including Demokratizatsiya, the Journal of Post-Soviet Democratization, Society, and Modern Greek Studies Yearbook, among others. He has been a frequent guest on the BBC, France 24, CivilNet, and other outlets. His most recent book, entitled Black Garden Aflame, the Nagorno-Karabakh Conflict in the Soviet and Russian press, analyzes Moscow's understanding of the Artsakh conflict through a careful, comprehensive investigation of articles, eyewitness accounts, and interviews. He is currently working on a new book charting the social, historical, and religious backgrounds of the Artsakh conflict. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Tonoyan.
Thank you, Maher, for the invitation, and thank you everyone for showing up. What I think is an important event. Well, so essentially, what I'm going to be talking about is a recap of my book that recently appeared, which should give you some idea of the things I'm doing, but I'll give you a little bit of a background about my work as well, so you have some understanding of where I come from. I'm originally from Armenia, from Gyumri. Been living in this United States for the last 2 decades or so. Started a family here, have had all my 3 children here, and so on and so forth. But I was also, before I came to the United States, I served in the Armenian military on the border in Tavush and witnessed some nasty fights and all that stuff. So I'm intimately familiar with the problem of Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm intimately familiar with the existential question that has beset Armenia ever since there has been an Armenia, I guess, but for all intents and purposes, this existential struggle has been intensified, and in the age of social media and easy access to the media and so on and so forth, these issues are far from being something that is happening somewhere else, but hits home and hits really hard for all of us. And I've had, in the war, I have lost family members and friends in the war of 2020. So it has been somewhat of a struggle to sort of to remain objective on a lot of these issues. But one of the things that they teach in graduate school is compartmentalization. Otherwise, you will just lose your mind thinking about these issues without any remove. So sort of that is sort of a little background about myself, and now about the book and about the thrust of the book and why I engaged in compiling the materials, and why everyone that is interested in Nagorno-Karabakh and Artsakh, especially in the last 30 years or so, should go out and buy it. I wish I could give it away for free, but such is the age of capitalism. If we lived in the Soviet Union, I would, but we live in the United States, I can't. So when the war was happening in the fall of 2020, and I was appearing in all these media fields, offering commentary and offering wisdom, which I didn't think I had, but I was the very few people that could offer something coherent on TV and in the media at the time. Something of revelation dawned on me that, especially going through the Western media's coverage of the conflict, there was a gaping hole of quality analysis and quality coverage. If you, like me, read religiously the New York Times, the coverage was anything but of quality, right? There was this person, Carlotta Gall, who produced a couple of really galling, pun intended, articles covering the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh and so on and so forth. But it was just a representative sample of the quality or the absence of it, of the coverage of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. So in the midst of all that, I realized that, well, there is another sort of school of journalism or another journalistic tradition, not better, not worse, but a tradition nonetheless, that has covered the conflict and has covered in much more intimate detail, much more extensively, and much more sort of deeper level, which has found very little audience in the West. And that journalistic tradition was the Soviet and Russian journalistic tradition. Now, again, I'm not saying it was better or worse than the Western journalistic tradition, but for all intents and purposes, not the least because of the geographic proximity of the conflict, the coverage of the Soviet and Russian press had been much more extensive. Whereas in the West, the conflict only appeared on a blip. When there's a conflict, journalists are dispatched, journalists write a dispatch or two, and then they move on to another conflict. Whereas for the Soviet and Russian journalists and their sort of contacts in Armenia and Azerbaijan, that was not the case. That were bound to be there for the long duration of the time. So what I did at the height of the conflict, I approached the CEO of the press that published the book, which is Eastview Press. It's a Minneapolis-based company. I approached and I said, Eastview sits on a huge database of Russian language materials since the Soviet era. And you must know about Eastview. If you have heard about JSTOR, Eastview is essentially JSTOR of Russian and Slavic languages, Chinese, Middle Eastern databases. They pretty much do not have a monopoly, but pretty nearly have a monopoly on scholarly and newspaper resources from these geographic locations. So I decided to go through all these Russian language databases from 1988 and just comb through thousands and thousands of articles and see how the Soviet and then the Russian journalists covered the conflict. So I went through around, I would say, 3,500 articles. It took me about 8 months. I probably read everything that was available on that platform. and went through these articles, combed through a fine comb, and boiled it down to around 350 articles. And of these 350 articles, I decided to chop them up into under four thematic umbrellas. One, the origins of the conflict, how the Soviet press covered the origins of the conflict, or actually tried not to cover even the original phase of the conflict, and then talk about the emergence of the conflict when Armenia and Azerbaijan become independent countries, how the conflict that started as a Soviet internal conflict became an international, essentially, conflict, because now two countries, or rather maybe three even, if we recognize Nagorno-Karabakh, right? It became an international conflict. The fourth phase, or the third part of the book, covers the negotiations phase, or the interwar period, how Russian press, then already Russian press because the Soviet Union no longer existed, how the Russian press covered, what were their obsessions, and how they reflected the Russian government's position on the conflict, and how they shaped the Russian government's perception of the conflict, and how various geopolitical interests that were making inroads into the South Caucasus region, how all of that played into Russian apprehensions, and so on and so forth. And the fourth and the final part of the book covers the period of what I term the road to war, from 2016 to the war in 2020. With the breakout of the hostilities in the April 4-day war of 2016, how the Russian press covered it, and how all of that sort of laid the foundation of the war to come in 2020. So that's sort of the type of the work I did. Right now, I'm working on analyzing all of these articles that I've combined, and trying to write something of it. But I'm also, inter alia, working on producing a monograph on the religious and social and historical background of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. It's a large project. It's been going on for Lord knows how long. Hopefully, I will make the final push, and something interesting will come out as a result. And then, I mean, so that's the kind of work I'm doing. I guess we can move from there, and we can have, with the Q&A, I can answer to more questions.
Thank you so much for Dr. Tonoyan for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Maher.
Next, we have Dr. Christina Maranci joining us. She's Harvard University's Marstos Chair of Armenian Studies. She is actually the first person of Armenian descent and the first woman to hold the position. Maranci has also held teaching positions at several world-renowned universities, including at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and Tufts University. She has published several books about Armenian art and architecture, the most recent of which, entitled The Art of Armenia, An Introduction, published in 2018, was the first English-language introduction to Armenian art. Maranci is a world-renowned expert in medieval Armenian history and has conducted timely and groundbreaking research about the preservation and history of ancient Armenian heritage sites. She has been featured on the Wall Street Journal, The Conversation, Hyperallergic, and the National Public Radio's Open Source Show. She was also recently elected the president of the Society for Armenian Studies. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Can you, yeah, okay, I'm not muted, am I? All right.
Nope, we can hear you.
Okay. So Maher, you asked me to talk a little bit about my work, and I'm just going to show some slides and talk a little bit. As Maher said, I am a professor, so I teach. My specialty is art history. I'm an art historian, and I teach Armenian art. And that's been what I've done for a long time, since around 2000. And that's also my area of research. I publish on Armenian art in all its facets. I'm particularly interested in Ani, and it was really through working on monuments in the Ani region that I became engaged with issues of cultural heritage. But just before we get to that, just a sense of the landscape. And what you see here in the distance is the Church of Meren, which is a church that I've been working on for many years. And this is a church that's south and east of Ani. When I teach Armenian art, I'm largely teaching it to people who don't know anything about it. So one of my roles is very much as an educator from ground zero. I teach a subject that isn't taught generally in college contexts, nor in art history textbooks. So it's, for me, I consider this actually an opportunity to, in a sense, rectify a long-standing omission in the sort of canon of art. My interest is in both art and architecture. So I'm interested in everything from churches like this to khachkars to sundials. Sundials, where are you, sundials? Sundials, in issues of art and technology, to manuscripts. You probably are aware, if you didn't actually visit the Met show in 2018, and I was involved with that, and that was really a moment to celebrate. It seems like a long time ago, but it was an extraordinary exhibition. For the first time, Armenia was mounted on the on the banners and in the galleries of this most important art institution, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so that was a really wonderful moment to be involved with. I've also put on exhibitions for closer to home. When I was teaching at Tufts, I used, and this was actually during the war, so it was last spring. I put on an exhibition at Tufts called Connecting Threads Survivor Objects, which was about textiles, Armenian textiles produced between the 17th and 19th centuries, at least one of which was from Nakhchivan. There was a chance again to educate people about these traces of cultural heritage and use them in a way to tell stories about the problems that the Armenian community faced and is facing. And it's a way that is immediately, I think, it's immediate, and it can engage people in a particular way that sometimes texts don't. So just to mention a few words about the Church of Meren, this was my focus for many years. It's a church, as you can tell, that is semi-ruined. It's missing the south facade, and it may soon lose its north facade. And once that happens, the church will fall down. The church is located in the military zone on the Turkish side of the international closed border with Armenia. You need permits to get there. And I've talked a lot about it, and I won't bore you because you may have already seen some of my other Zooms. It is a church that was listed, and I was glad to be a part of this. I was listed on the watch list for the World Monuments Fund. Now, I know that Maher wanted me to talk a little bit about what you can do. And I'll just, because I will forget if I don't say it right now, you can list monuments with the World Monuments Fund. And this is a watch list. That means it's a 3-year action list where it's not like UNESCO. You can make an application for a monument to be included. And so this is an opportunity. It's not easy. It can be complex, but it's something that you can do. Anybody can do if you want to. So I'm happy to talk more about that. That's what I did for the Church of Meren, and it was indeed listed for those years. And we did laser scanning at the site, which was really really important. The first stage of any kind of restoration, you need to record exactly what it is you have. So I won't talk too much more, but this is just to say that we're now going to continue to do work at Maran in the coming year, and that's very exciting. You know, part of my work, and again, I think this may respond a little bit to some of Mayor's questions to me. I've worked a lot on his historiography of Armenian art and architecture, and which itself is fraught and bound up with issues of race and nation. And one thing I've noticed is how interconnected these different spheres of knowledge and ideas are. So that's why I've made this fun diagram for you to show you some of these interlinked ideas. And that is that there's a direct connection between, let's say, heritage and heritage destruction and academic scholarship. And we can talk about that more in a bit. But yeah, so that's sort of where I work. I work on at-risk monuments for the most part, most of them in Western Armenia / Eastern Turkey. Here are just a few of them, and you may be familiar with them. And so, you know, since the war, I've certainly been involved in trying to raise awareness about the monuments, given a million Zooms, written an op-ed and lots of articles, and now co-authored a book. But the struggle obviously continues, and you know, the problem that we face is, of course, as you know, not just erasure or vandalism or desecration, but it's also the invention of false narratives. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm happy to talk with you about you know, possible ways to approach it. So that's all for me. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Maranci. Next up, we have Mr. Simon Maghakyan. Mr. Maghakyan is a Denver-based researcher and organizer. His civic tenure includes nonpartisan service at Colorado's legislature, human rights monitoring and advocacy at Amnesty International USA, community development for 18 ANCA Western Region states, as well as leadership at Eastern Prelacy's Save Armenian Monuments Initiative and on the Western Diocese Artsakh Heritage Committee. Maghakyan is a lecturer at the University of Colorado, Denver, non-resident PhD student in heritage crime at Great Britain's Cranfield University, and visiting scholar at Tufts University. His initiatives include the Colorado State Capital Armenian Genocide Khachkar Memorial, Julfa.com, and the research firm Heritage Intel. Maghakyan's writing has appeared in numerous media outlets, including Time Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. His collaborative 2019 Hyperallergic and 2021 The Art newspaper investigative exposés of Azerbaijan's cultural genocide in Nakhichevan have been cited in Armenia's International Court of Justice case against Azerbaijan. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Maghakyan.
Thank you, Mahed, for the invitation. And it's so great to see so many young people spending their Sunday afternoon / evening for an educational session, as opposed to dealing sort of the stress of having to start the new week, probably close to finals or whatever projects you have. And goes to an Artyom, older buddies, and in this work. In fact, I saw Christina and Artyom just last week in Los Angeles. We were there for a conference. I saw Maher, Lucine, and others in the UCLA ASA team earlier in Los Angeles at in the ANCA grassroots conference. So it's really amazing to see so much engagement. And I know this is a time where not engaging may sound or feel like the right thing to do. Oftentimes we see the hopelessness and the depression, that we as a community experience, sort of being sometimes sort of misdirected rage, whether it's on social media or in other platforms. Other times we see people who are just completely disengaged from everything as a way of coping with the situation. And then we have people like you, despite everything, are here spending your Sunday. And this is for both the students and the scholars. And I don't know if you realize how cool the panel is, not including me. So Dr. Maranci is the first Armenian and the first woman to lead Harvard's Armenian Studies, which is amazing for our community and for gender equity. And Artyom is in my view, the best informed scholar on the Artsakh conflict. I mean, I happen to be very privileged and be friends with both of them, and just, it's like having access to encyclopedias of knowledge. So it's a huge privilege to be part of this panel. So I want to see if you guys are able to use the reactions. If you can use the reaction, can you put like the I don't know, thumbs up thing? See if you use it. Okay, awesome, great. So undo that, or I guess itself. I just wanted to 19 years old. Just curious, like how many of you are 19 or close to that? Okay, several of you. The reason why I'm asking this, I actually started this topic when I was 19. I was in college. I remember it was December 2005. I had just finished the finals, and then reading news at the time, there wasn't really social media outside blog posts, right? And some online forums. So I was reading the news, the traditional way of the internet era, which was just going on websites. And then I saw that this destruction of the world's largest Armenian cemetery was happening. And of course, I was devastated and upset, but I also thought that now this is going to be frontline news everywhere, front page coverage. So foolish me, I went on like the BBC's, CNN's, and New York Times of the world, and there was nothing about it. Not that day, not the next day, not next week or next month. And so this is how I kind of got engaged in the subject of documenting the destruction that happened in the Julfa Cemetery, or Jura, the world's largest collection of medieval khachkars. Actually, Lucine was in Denver when we unveiled a replica of them at the Colorado State Capitol in 2015. And actually, that event had, creating a replica of this khachkar, I thought this was my last thing to do. I'll be done with this. I'd done a film, a website, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 2018, I got married. Lucine was there for that too. She's my niece, if you haven't figured it out yet. And so I thought like this was all behind me. I was never going to get involved in this. Started thinking of actually opening, businesses so I could, earn decent income. And then I haven't shared this too publicly, but I was helping this documentary on cultural destruction, not to engage, but I gave them a lengthy interview, actually even helped them fundraise for it. And it was really supposed to be primarily about what happened in Nakhichevan, especially to Julfa, and then, ISIS, etc. So I watched the documentary. In fact, they were videotaping part of the unveiling in Denver. They'd flown in. I watched the documentary and they had taken out everything about what happened in Nakhichevan. So I was really pissed because I thought, well, this was a chance to tell the story of what happened. And I had known all that time that actually the destruction was not just of Jura, but of other monuments. And so this is how an investigation in hyperallergic took place that I'll go over very quickly. And then again, a similar thing. I mean, it got a lot of coverage. I was excited about it, but I thought I would, step away and do other things. And then the war started, right? And next we know, all of us are back in this and actually trying to get ourselves out of the situation. So very quickly, I'm going to go through some slides to make this more interesting. Can you see the slides? Okay, great. So the top one is actually in 2013. I was in Iran, and that flat field was Julfa or Jura. This is where the world's largest cemetery had existed for centuries. And this was just like the most astonishing things I'd seen in my life. I mean, I knew going in, I'd done a lot of project on this, even convinced earlier, like the American Association for the Advancement of Science to run their satellites. Like one of the first investigations from space into cultural destruction. So I knew exactly what was going on, but it's just very shocking. Like, imagine going to a cultural place that you grew up learning about, and then just seeing that flat field in the backdrop. That's what remains. And just the one image of how beautiful the khachkars of Julfa looked here is just an image from the early 20th century. And it's the person who's standing there, I think, now becoming an actor and a photographer himself, but was photographed by his researcher father. So the 2019 investigation that I co-authored and initiated, I co-authored with another student named Sarah Pickman, who was around my age. She was also 1920 when the destruction of Julfa happened. She actually wrote a piece in Archaeology magazine at the time. And so we had connected, we made the film together, etc. And so when I was working on that investigation, because I was pissed off that they left Armenians from the documentary, it was just too much. I mean, I couldn't sleep. I was going crazy. So I reached out to Sarah Pickman. At the time, she was a PhD student at Yale, and now she's a doctor in history. I'm sure we'll hear her name, in other fields in years and decades to come. But we took a lot of the field research that had been done by a photographer named Artyom Tonoyan, and eyewitness accounts from Azerbaijan and official publications, et cetera, and then we concluded that the field results that Tonoyan had done in the 60s and 80s, when he would covertly document cultural monuments, like the 89 churches, the number now was 0. The 5,840 khachkars or cross stones number is now 0. The estimated 22,000 tombstones number is now 0. So when you hear like 28,000 Armenian monuments were destroyed in Nakhichevan, this is how the count is done. Some people might say, well, the khachkars and tombstones were in cemeteries, so, make a smaller number. But Tonoyan, who is this man to the left, had actually documented every single of those stones. And so we respected the way he had counted them. And then he has a map showing all the major places documented. Of course, some of the more major places in Nakhichevan were Surkarapet to the left, and of course, Jura to the right. On the left, you have a photo by Stephen Sim, a Scottish researcher who sneaked in. He saw bare ground, and on the right is a portion of that satellite investigation done in 2009. So, and of course, a lot more investigations have been done in recent years. In fact, in recent months, an amazing project by Caucasus Heritage Watch is documenting what's happening in Artsakh today, but also they recently released a sort of a complete comprehensive database of all the sites that were flattened. But this was an investigation that I did with them earlier. It got published in the Art magazine, the Art newspaper, and these are declassified Soviet era satellite images that are not easily available, but now they're available. And you can see how just, Armenian sites have completely disappeared from Nakhichevan. Of course, Azerbaijan's government denies it. It says these monuments never existed in the first place, even though there's plenty of evidence of their existence, not just in satellites, but also in Azerbaijan's memory. Like this was actually displayed in Baku in 2020 of a famous Azerbaijani artist who had documented the Armenian churches in Nakhichevan. Of course, if you go to his museum and his books published in Azerbaijan, they have erased the Armenian churches that he has documented from his work. So what are the lessons of the destruction that happened in Nakhichevan that are important to us and can inform us how to move forward? One thing is that destruction does not happen overnight. So destruction started in the first phase in 1997. The deadline for the final erasure was late 2006, although some destruction might have happened, even a year or so later. So, when we say Azerbaijan wants to erase the Armenian monuments in Artsakh, we're not talking about just today or tomorrow or next year. Sometimes it takes a decade. Destructions happen for several reasons, but sometimes they have triggers that are important international developments or opportunities, just like, wars or genocides that are not planned at the moment. They have been planning for a long time. I think the most important lessons is that absence of Armenians at their sacred sites enables The latter is destruction. The first absence is theoretical, right? Because Azerbaijan will say those are not Armenian monuments. So they're separating us. And then is the actual physical separation or segregation. And then that's when the destruction happened. And the same thing is happening in Artsakh today. They're not only theoretically separating the Armenian culture from Armenians, but no one is allowed to visit those sites under occupation. And then another important part is Aliya's impunity, which was, of course, with Nakhichevan, but he also learned it through the Safarov case when he managed to release and get away with the release of that axe murderer in 2012. Another important lesson is that destruction can be prevented. Sometimes I think Armenian academia and organizing circles, we tend to have those self-fulfilling prophecies of saying that things are going to be horrible, but then we're not really taking the steps to prevent destruction. And I think that's really an important self-criticism we should have as a community. And because of that, leave no stone unturned in saving Armenian monuments. Not just, if we lose the war, say, okay, well, we lost the war, that's the end of it. Do more things. And there are things that are being done. And the other thing is never give up, because I think we gave up on Nakhichevan. We knew the destruction started, at least in 1998, we had reports of the destruction that started. And I don't think Armenia or the Armenian community ever took all the necessary steps to prevent it. So let's not do that again. And so how can it apply to Artsakh today more specifically? One is ending Aliyev's cycle of impunity. I mean, that's much easier said than done, but we, again, need to leave no stone unturned in seeking that. Remote monitoring missions that are happening. I already mentioned Caucasus Heritage Watch with their satellites. There's also Monument Watch. There's an AUA, American University of Armenia project. There's also on-the-ground monitoring, because from locals in Artsakh, the parts that are under Armenian control, because you can see some of the sites. There's international movements. There's the ICJ lawsuit. There's some media coverage. We saw the European Parliament resolution. I think the important part of this discussion should be the depoliticization of sacred sites. Of course, politics and history are too intertwined in the Caucasus, and that's a very long discussion that we could have. But it's important to drive the message for everyone that we shouldn't look at monuments and just think of their belonging or proving something. We should have a basic respect for their sacredness, regardless of their complex histories. And then last but not least, and probably the most important point, is the access pilgrimages and worship. Because when Armenians have no access to sacred sites, that's when the destruction will end. We see the opposite of that in Iran, where you do have preservation of at least the major Armenian sites in northern Iran. We've seen in the work of Martyros Saryan, after Khetskong ended up being under Turkish control, talking about the pilgrimages that happened, like in some ways foreseeing the destruction that was going to happen later on. We see Armenian pilgrims going to Turkey and finding remains of their heritage, but even those pilgrimages, those visits allow for some preservation. And even in places like Van, where the government is managing or micromanaging the propaganda, the vendors start spelling Akhtamar correctly because of interaction with Armenians. And I want to end by saying that just as we need our monuments for our culture and our well-being as a community, as individuals, our culture and our monuments need us for their survival. So let's really leave no stone unturned in ensuring the saving of whatever we can in the Armenian heritage that is under Azerbaijan's control today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Maghakyan, for the very insightful opening remarks. I want to move to the Q&A portion of this discussion, and at the end we'll also have some audience questions, which I'm very much looking forward to. Our first question I'd like to direct to Dr. Tonoyan. So when we speak about this cultural genocide of Armenian heritage sites, we're of course often talking about ancient Armenian churches and crossstones that the Azeris are trying to destroy or to discredit. And generally, I think we've oftentimes seen the Artsakh conflict and the broader Armenian struggle framed in religious terms by some analysts and media figures. Could you speak to this framing and the the religious backgrounds of this conflict, and also about, in your research, whether this framing has been widespread in the Russian coverage of the conflict.
Well, first off, it should be said that this framing is rather lazy, because it's just lazy. It's an easy, low-hanging fruit. Armenians are obviously by and large Christians. Azerbaijanis are by and large Muslims. What can explain the conflict? Oh, well, the religious differences. So it's easy for the journalists to go and frame it like that. There is no extensive scholarship talking about it, of having a religious sort of that a religious principle is involved as one of the main motivations of the conflict, which is not to say that religion is not present in the conflict. Okay, the conflict is not religious. This is not holy war versus jihad. We're not in medieval times. The conflict sources are found in different areas. It's mostly about land, and almost exclusively about land and cultural rights and so on and so forth. But religion by itself, let's say, when I look at the conflict, I studied, by training, I'm a sociologist and sociologist of religion. I study what motivates a certain human behavior in society. So that's sort of my disciplinary loyalties. That's where they lie. And when you look at the conflict, you can look and I have come across multiple instances, a lot of instances where religion has been offered as sort of a vehicle for justification of a behavior of one kind or another. The religion throughout the conflict has been instrumentalized by both Armenians and Azerbaijanis, not necessarily on government level, but also on government level. One of the reasons religion usually is called upon in conflicts is because it has such an emotional and psychological agency that ethnic entrepreneurs and government functionaries and government officials usually find it easy to go to religious personalities and religious leadership and ask them, or themselves use formulations that touch human beings at their core, at their psychological core. Now, the funny thing about this conflict is that usually the Armenian government or Armenian, side will say that the conflict is not religious, but Azerbaijanis are using religion to rally Islamic countries around its cause. And the Azerbaijanis will say, yeah, the conflict is not religious, but look at the Christian countries that come to Armenia's side. So so in that sense, it has this weird dynamic that we say it's not religious, but the other is using the religious card to advance its cause and so on and so forth. But it is an interesting, religion has provided an interesting dimension and in some senses intractability in the discourse about the conflict, because religion, there's a Rudolf Bultmann, turn of the century famous German theologian, who says religion is ultimately about ultimate matters. And in war situations, it is about ultimate matters, and religion becomes, in a sense, or yields itself to be manipulated, to be used and abused. So I know it's not coherent in a sense an answer, but it is both present and not present, but present not in the sense that the journalists and their framing say it is present. The religion is much more complex in the conflict. So it's not just a simple binary. So.
Thank you for the answer.
Yeah.
Dr. Maranci, there is a relation between academia and cultural erasure and genocide. And, we have all heard, I think, about the ludicrous historical revisionism done by Azeri academics and media personalities, claiming that Armenian churches or Armenian heritage sites are Caucasian, Albanian. As the newly elected president of the Society for Armenian Studies and the head of Harvard's Armenian Studies Institute, can you talk about these falsifications and the responsibility that academics have to speak out against them?
Sure. First thing to say is there's a kind of sliding scale of falsehoods. So there's the Caucasian Albanian circus as it plays out in various silly tweets. But at the other end is a kind of what seems like a studied silence by scholars of some repute who simply talk about, let's say, Caucasian Albania, and kind of give it a gravity, give it a density, with very much a kind of conspicuous blank space where there should be a discussion about the weaponization of that group, that obscure group. I would say that there is certainly a responsibility on the part of academics to dispel these falsehoods, precisely because they have the knowledge and they've done the research. And so I think, coming to it from my perspective, there's really an obligation to do that. The trick is, that's the easy answer, but the trick is, how do you respond? And so, for example, like if somebody says the pyramids were built by space aliens, how much time are you going to spend dispelling that, right? On the other hand, the other piece of this is to do, and I think this is just as important, do the good work, model real research on Nagorno-Karabakh, on Artsakh, on Armenia and Armenian monuments, modeling what it means to do real research with real sources, with real language knowledge. That's not something that's coming out of the Azeris, Caucasian, Albanian machine. So I think that this is something that can be done in multiple ways and should be done and is being done. And I'm looking at my two colleagues here who are doing this work. And for some of us, it's a kind of, it feels a bit like, for me, I'd been working on monuments in Western Armenia. And so when all this sort of started happening, like so many others, I had to get up to speed on the medieval Artsakh. There's a lot to know. And I think understanding the complexity of that world, and that's something that really gets lost in the Twitterverse, the fact that we're dealing with, this is, a really interesting, complicated place with a lot going on and shifting, so much is shifting conditions, and the monuments reflect that. So, yes, we should be speaking out. We are speaking out, but it's a question, and I think it's strategic in how you do it, when you do it, and to whom you do it.
Thank you so much for the thoughtful answer. Mr. Maghakyan, you have done some truly incredible and impactful work exposing the ongoing cultural genocide perpetrated by the Azerbaijani authorities in the occupied territories. So I'm curious about, you spoke about the lessons that we learned from Nakhichevan. Are we seeing a repetition of the Nakhichevan playbook, so to speak, in the newly occupied territories of Artsakh? And what warning signs can we look to kind of signal what their intentions are here?
Well, it's a very thoughtful question. I think I alluded to part of this side. So let's just talk about the timeline that happened in Nakhichevan. In 1988 is when the last Armenians were either voluntarily or brutally expelled from Nakhichevan. It's actually, sometimes there are no witnesses left to tell the story. For example, we only recently learned how the last Armenian in Agulis was killed because Akram Aylisli, that famous Azerbaijani historian or novelist, and one of his essays recently described the last Armenian resident of Agulis in 1988 that no one in the Armenian community had known of. So 1988 is when Armenians were cleansed out from Nakhichevan. Of course, if we had, Azerbaijani audience here that would say, well, the same thing happened. Azerbaijanis also, were forced to leave. So I don't want to say this is completely a black and white story. But when it comes to the cultural destruction that happened in Nakhichevan, it's a very black and white story. So 1988, Armenians leave. Even before they were forced to leave, through the Soviet era, there were conditions created that compelled the Armenians to leave. Some call it this weird term that I think is a bad term called white genocide, meaning bloodless genocide. And of course, it means, in white supremacist circles in the US, that means something completely different. So there was that slow motion ethnic cleansing that happened in the Soviet era. But starting in the 50s, Azerbaijan had already started this theory that Armenian monuments were not Armenian monuments, they were Albanian monuments that belonged to the ancestors of Azerbaijanis, therefore Armenian monuments were Azerbaijani monuments. And this was also propagated throughout Nakhichevan. So by the time Armenians left, the mainstream propaganda in Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan was that those Christian monuments are Azerbaijani monuments, right? So you would expect that they would be preserved, but the war happened. Azerbaijan lost the war. Some might say, well, okay, so was it a revenge for the destruction? Actually, I have to say no, because it did not have popular support among the Azerbaijani populace for a very specific reason. Most of them thought those were non-Armenian monuments. Maybe there was not the absolute majority, but it was a big chunk of the population. So this was not a populist thing to do. But in 1997, there was some realignments, geopolitical realignments, that brought Armenians and Russians together and brought Azerbaijan and Turkey closer together. So I think that was part of the trigger that the destruction started in 1997. So from 1997, almost 10 years, right? So it took 10 years. Armenians were physically not present at their sacred, which is by 98, a lot of the churches had been blasted out. By the way, they were using landmines, and landmines can be reprogrammed to be made into just remotely explodable bombs. So landmines were used, and we know this because of Akram Aylisli. He revealed a telegram that he had sent to Heydar Aliyev in 1997 when the destruction started, and which was not published outside 50 copies in Russian until the hyperallergic investigation. So, Aylisli did, a huge favor to this cause by leaking that information to me through mutual contacts to get it out. When this destruction okay, now this is so embarrassing. I completely lost my train of thought because I jumped from one place to another. So I was talking about, the separation happened from 88 to 1997. Yes, then I was going to Julfa's destruction, which happened a year later in 98. So they don't destroy the visible monument first. They destroy the ones that are, behind the curtain, so to say. 98, they started the destruction of Julfa, which is on Iran's border. There's some protests. They tried that again in 2002, 2003. Again, some protests, they stopped. And then in 2005, they get completely emboldened and then just wipe it out. And I'm still looking into that reasons behind that. I mean, obviously, that's when they start pumping oil and they were able to bribe UNESCO. But I think, and this is a new theory I'm still looking into, Azerbaijan was upset that the Erdogan government was basically using propaganda, the Ahtama renovation propaganda, but acknowledging some, Armenian history to some degree. And they were like, no, we're not going to go that route. We're going to go the complete erasure, physical erasure route. So if you think about this time frame that happened, if we apply it to what's going on in Artsakh today, right? So Armenians were expelled in 2020. They're not allowed to visit their sacred sites, right? I mean, there's some satellites and there's some images that emerge, but there's really no one on the ground to report what's going on. And they've already done and are doing the propaganda. So I think as soon as we lose sight of those monuments, not just physically, but also stopping the advocacy and the talking about them, that's when we're going to really enable this destruction to happen right away. And I mean, some of this has already happened. In September, Caucasus Heritage Watch released information about a smaller church called Surp Sarkis in Mokhrenes, which is in occupied Hadrut region, that was destroyed. So there, and I actually wrote a piece in November 2020 in Asia Times, kind of predicting the phased destruction that was going to happen. And I said first, it will be the smaller monuments first and cemeteries, and unfortunately, there's several examples of that. And then there'll be the smaller, lesser known churches, and then polishing off Armenian inscriptions of. And ultimately, if they get away with this, I mean, they're going to flatten Darivank one day. If we get the same exact thing that happened in Nakhichevan, which was at some point Armenians completely gave up. And some of that had to do with this patriotic research that was being done, and everyone's saying everything has been destroyed. Like you can go read reports from 2002, 2003 saying everything in Julfa has been destroyed, which is not true. The monuments have been toppled. So that's one reason why I'm like very obsessed about getting everything right, because we actually can shoot ourselves in the foot. So we're in a really, really bad place today, but in a much, much better place than we were when the destruction in Nakhichevan started, because of satellites, because of attention, etc. And frankly, and also because I think scholars like Professor Maranci are not afraid to say, to identify themselves as both scholars, but also advocates of cultural preservation. I think for a long time, Armenian scholarship had kind of bought into this view that, in order to be objective, you have to separate yourself from the advocacy. But if you're doing that, I think to paraphrase Professor Maranci, you're basically allowing destruction of your research materials if you're not advocating for their preservation. So I think we need more of that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Dr. Tonoyan, the fight for the rights and the safety, really, of the indigenous population of Artsakh has been a long and an arduous one. With the invasion of Azerbaijan into sovereign, internationally recognized territory of Armenia in September this year, looming large in our minds, are there prospects for peace in the region? Of course, there are some diplomatic processes that are unfolding. There have been, some high-level diplomatic talks talking about, and then statements talking about a long and lasting peace. What can we expect from these processes, and how will some of the issues we've talked about today be addressed, if at all?
Well, this was a tough question, in the sense that I wish I knew all the answers, and I wish I was sitting in the government in Yerevan and everybody listened to what I was saying. There is always a prospect for peace. Peace is not elusive, but at what price and on what terms? That is the crux of the question. Now, Armenia, there is always this idea that Armenia is facing a giant, a David against the Goliath dynamic is present there, and we can punch above our weight. The problem is that Armenia is facing not one Goliath, but multiple Goliaths. One David can maybe have a chance against one Goliath, but mathematically, when you have more than one Goliath, your chances are slim to none. And it is the precariousness of the Armenian situation right now, and where we find ourselves. And it's not helpful that we have, I don't want to be this rabid anti-Nicole type. I hate those caricatures. But it is one of the problems that Armenia has a government that I don't think is fully capable of articulating what it wants, articulating what it needs, and articulating what it can do and cannot do. It's also compounding the problem. The problem is already a large one. The problem is already an intractable one. But when you have a government in place where it cannot uphold the best interests of the state that is in its care, it compounds the problem. And sometimes when you sit in Minneapolis in a bunker such as this, when outside it's 10 degrees, it is easy to fall into despair and say, my God, is this even going to survive? Is this thing even going to survive? So it's a very, very tough situation. And I am a peacenik Monday through Wednesday, militant Thursday through Sunday. So I find myself constantly battling these two demons on my shoulders that are not visible to you, but they're still here. I hear their voices. And, don't think I'm a psychopath. It's just the Gyumretzi speaking in me. But what can Armenia do to have an equitable peace? Armenia is in essence right now, given the dynamics on the ground, is in essence negotiating with a highway robber. Literally, Azerbaijan wants to open a highway through Armenia, right? So it is in a sense a highway robbery. And how do you negotiate with a highway robber if you do not have the wherewithals to do that? So I'm just hoping, and on Sundays I usually also pray that, some sort of a miracle or, some sort of a real material, tangible aid can be rendered to Armenia diplomatically and politically. I understand that militarily that aid will not be forthcoming from the West, but some sort of a tangible, constructive help that goes beyond patting us in the back and saying, guys, manage it as best as you can. So that is sort of my complicated, not hopeful, but with a grain of hope answer. And it also depends on the lot of us. I'm doing my best to rectify it. And I think the very fact that you guys are here speaks to the fact that you take these issues seriously, you take it to heart, you take it to mind. And I admire your passion, and I admire your dedication to your Armenianness, to your Armenian culture. And just take it one step further and be even more active, be even more productive, because you're doing it for yourself, but also for my kids who are growing up, and for your kids and for your relatives and for your brothers and sisters. So I hope it gave you some pastoral wisdom. I imparted some pastoral wisdom. It's a Sunday. It's the Lord's day. So
thank you so much for the answer. I think it was very relatable to all of us. The peacenik and the militant is very much something that I think a lot of Armenians feel on a day-to-day basis. We all hear the voices, I think, in our heads. Dr. Maranci, when we talk about Armenian culture, cultural genocide, loss of these monuments, it's of course important for us to understand first what we have and what we thus risk to lose. How far back we trace the history of some of these churches and monuments? And also, you spoke in your answer earlier about how, since you study mostly the monuments that are in Western Armenia, you have had to kind of catch up to speed with the medieval Artsakh monuments. What have you noticed in terms of the architecture of the Armenian churches there, and how they differ from the churches that you have studied, or the monuments that you have studied for most of your career?
Sure, and let me just start by saying that there's a very interesting imbalance in terms of the amount of scholarship on monuments in Western Armenia versus those in Artsakh, and just in general, there's less scholarship on those monuments in Artsakh. So it's not like there are a lot of specialists out there on Artsakh, and this is a problem now we can see, and we all have to play catch up with this. So yes, the evidence that we have for Christian architecture in Artsakh is very early. We have, of course, the really amazing early Christian basilica from Tigranakert in Artsakh, but we get our first dates from Paustos, from the epic histories of 5th century. We get the mention of Amaras. And that's an amazing site. If you've been to Amaras, the tomb of the grandson of Gregory the Illuminator is very much typical of early Christian architecture. So it's right, sort of, it's compared well to early Christian architecture in other parts of Armenia, Yereruk, and other places. So it fits very well into that. I mean, I could sort of trot out a nice corpus for you of the churches of the reach of Artsakh, but the main thing is we get a tremendous variety and spread chronologically from the 5th century, obviously to the 19th century, even with Kazanche, etc. But it's a tremendous corpus that is both very clearly connected to architectural and artistic traditions in Greater Armenia, and yet there are interesting, distinct things, whether it's a two-apsed church, or whether it's a gallery above the apse, but all of these things unfortunately are in need of study, and because of the situation, that's not easy. So this is quite sad, both in terms of what's been lost, but also not just in terms of material what's been lost, but the questions that we in some cases can't really explore right now. But the other thing I wanted to mention is there are many other ways in which the artistic production of Artsakh connects to Greater Armenia that may not seem immediately as obvious. For example, we have hundreds of inscribed dated khachkars from all around Artsakh, Utik, the whole area. And these use the Armenian calendar quite specifically. And the written formulae that are used in the inscriptions is perfectly standard and within the Armenian tradition, and so that's something that's important to understand. So this is a tradition that can only be understood. Let's put it this way. If we want to try to understand it, the only way is through medieval Armenian art and architecture. That's the only comparative evidence that can be used, right? And that's the problem that Azerbaijan faces with regard to the Caucasian. They can claim Caucasian Albania all they want, but if they try to make any sense of the material, it's so obvious when they just ignore all these obvious parallels. Like I could again throw like Tsitsernavank and Ashtarak Tsiranavor. They're very, very similar. So it's very glaring, at least if you know the monuments, to see that kind of omission. So it's an incredibly rich tradition. I'd really love to have I'd love to work with a student specifically on Artsakh and really get into it, because even if it's not possible right now to visit the sites that one wants to visit, you can start with desk research. And this is something, by the way, and getting back to Artyom's, wish to create some kind of sense of optimism. I wasn't allowed to go to Moran for a long time. And Moran, the Church of Moran, I was crestfallen. You can imagine, it was the place I wanted to go to do my work. But I just dug in, and I just thought, they're not going to stop me from doing work on this church. And if anybody should say to me, oh, but you didn't go there, so, you know, you lack credibility, I'll just let them have it, because this is how the silence happens. You, just because you can't go and do the field work, it doesn't mean you can't talk about these places. And we're so lucky because there has been wonderful documentation of all these sites, not necessarily a lot of interpretation and social history and all the wonderful things that can be done, but we have the documentation, we have the inscriptions, we have the plans. So a wonderful thing for students to do is to dig into this material and start asking questions, historical questions, you know, religious questions. That's all something that we can do. And we don't, you know, and a byproduct is it will raise attention, you know, because you'll be talking about it. So yeah, anyway.
Thank you so much. Mr. Maghakyan, you have talked a bit about your diligent work on compiling reports of cultural erasure and other atrocities, and presenting them to influential people across the world. What has been the response of the international community to these ongoing issues, and what mechanisms can we use to both preserve our monuments and to punish the Azerbaijani regime for its conduct?
Thank you for that question. You know, it's a tough one to answer. And just like Dr. Tonoyan was saying, you know, this is, you know, when it comes to war and peace, he and you may also said, you know, we hear all these voices, all of us, which is absolutely correct. You know, a part of me has obviously been very frustrated through the years of, you know, how little, not just coverage, I mean, research has been done, and not just by international organizations. But then another part of me recently realized that actually we did get, you know, a wave of press coverage, especially after the Armenians lost the war and the ceasefire capitulation was signed in November 2020. I mean, if you look at that time, it was in some ways the leading story in the relevant sections in newspapers across the world, but a very briefly lived one. Of course, a lot of frustration goes against UNESCO, which is the very organization charged with protecting global heritage. And there's the obvious bribery that has happened, not just to Irina Bokova, whose bribery has been caught, but I think even more so, her predecessor, Goichiro Matsura, who must have greenlighted the final erasure of Julfa in 2005. And he had an open state position with Azerbaijan after retirement, etc. So we can, you know, look at UNESCO and say that it has been an absolute failure, especially when we can pinpoint to this obvious bribery that has taken place. But on the other hand, you know, the more we study UNESCO, the more we understand the limitations and constraints it has. It's a state member governed body where a lot of the decisions are made by state actors. So like a committee has representatives from various countries and they make the decisions. In terms of the secretariat, it has limitations. You know, it has donor countries like Azerbaijan that they have to be careful with. And it also, you know, often follows sort of the geopolitical preferences of the United States that are set by US foreign policy priorities. Although one of the reasons why UNESCO became so bribable was that, you know, it was defunded at some point by the United States, its biggest contributor. But let's leave the UNESCO aside and just look at the other international response. I think when it comes to setting the narrative of what happened in Nakhichevan, you know, unquestionably, since 2019, that's no longer an issue. The correct narrative has been established, but I think we're still struggling, you know, with damage and some destruction that happened toward Islamic monuments in Nagorno-Karabakh, the parts, especially outside the Soviet-era boundaries of Artsakh, that a lot of times, I think a lot of us have kind of avoided that and you know, not acknowledged or not studied. when the reality is that, yeah, I mean, there was, in my personal assessment, some few cases of unacceptable behavior, but not a state-sponsored one. But I mean, objectively speaking, a lot of times, on average, it was really a matter of failed upkeep. And I think Caucasus Heritage Watch is going to issue a report very soon that documents that, and that's, I think, their conclusion as well. And so I think there's been a struggle where, for example, if you look at the latest U.S. State Department Religious Freedom Report, which for the first time acknowledges the destruction happening in Nakhichevan, and then acknowledges all the cases of destruction that have happened under Azerbaijan's control of, the territories it won over in 2020. And then the Azerbaijani section, when you read it, it says something like, and there has been destruction or desecration or damage of hundreds of, Islamic sites, whether it's cemeteries, etc. And when I read that, I'm like, okay, I mean, this desecration and destruction are completely different things, right? Like someone scratches your car or totals your car are completely two different things. So I think that's the next struggle, is kind of acknowledging what has happened under Armenian control, not letting Azerbaijan get away with its propaganda. I think that would be a healthy move. And I think that's exactly why Azerbaijan has been banning UNESCO from visiting the region, because ultimately, yeah, Armenians are not angels, but the reality is much, much different than the one Azerbaijan has been portraying. So I think we really need to encourage any and every investigation. I just think, regardless if there are some wrongs that Armenians have made, it's the good thing is always acknowledging the truth and giving the full context, because it always helps, like not the victim group, but the group that's much more vulnerable, I think, right? And it's without question that Armenians are really the ones with an existential threat in the region, not only in the short term, but in the long term. In terms of other responses, yeah, we saw European Parliament resolutions. We've seen some statements from like the World Council of Churches, et cetera, et cetera. Those are good, but they are not enough. There needs to be constant work on this front. So Christina, Artyom, and I are part of the diocese Artsakh Heritage Committee based in Los Angeles, we and other scholars and expert practitioners. And I think one discussion we're having right now is kind of what is going to be the moving mechanism to consistently inform, connect, and activate a lot of potential allies and external stakeholders in this process, because it's not something that will happen on its own. It will require constant engagement. But one thing this will be the last thing I'll say, is to show that actually we're getting more coverage when we think, right? So I think a lot of you see coverage of destruction of Armenian heritage, whether it's in the Guardian and Los Angeles Times, even the New York Times had a story, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, those seem to be like occasional stories, but there is still several dozen of them if you put them together. And the Wall Street Journal that Dr. Maranci also had a piece in right after the war. If you look at those things, they don't seem enough, but I'll give you an example. So the way I get published very often is I make a lot of pitches, and it's a very frustrating process. And I shouldn't be doing that because, I mean, that's not my job. I'm not getting paid for it, and it's not my PhD. So that's not part of my career, but my mind won't like stop, right? Because I'm like, okay, our narrative's not getting out there, so I have to do it. It's really not a good strategic move on my part, but I still do it. But so I got really upset that that oligarch in Armenia, Gagik Tsarukyan, is building the 3D statue of Christ, which basically undoes, whatever, however say that word. It reverses Armenian theology of centuries, because now we're going to have a sacred site, and undoubtedly it will become a place of worship of a 3D statue of Christ that's the Armenian church is against. It's destroying cultural monuments. And it's just like this ridiculous thing is building like a giant Christ statue in a country that needs a lot of other things. Like that's the last thing Armenia needs. And so I pitched to every newspaper in the world. No one is interested in the story. I thought this would be a really cool story, right? Like Armenia's richest and dumbest person is building the world's largest Christ statue in violation of Armenian church tradition. No one wants that story, right? But a lot of newspapers want the story of Azerbaijan destroying our monuments, right? So the media is not as uninterested as we think it is. We need to push harder and harder. And frankly, we need to kind of institutionalize some of this. Like we can't just completely rely on volunteers to keep doing this work, but that's exactly what's going to be needed to take this work forward, because I don't think we're ever going to learn sort of the lessons of our history of just winging things. Yesterday, we had Rubina Perumian, the historian in town in Denver for another conference. She met with our Saturday schools in Denver. It's, we're a small community, and we had lunch later on. And so we were discussing, these issues, whether we'll ever learn our lessons from history. And something I said is, well, probably not. We've been winging it for 2,500 years. I just hope we'll be able to, keep winging it. But I know that Dr. Tonoyan in particular is not as hopeful as I am. I talked way too much. I'll stop.
Thank you so much for the really, really comprehensive and interesting response. Our final question in the prepared Q&A section is something that I think is top of mind for, of course, all of you and also our students. And you've all talked about this to some extent in your other answers. But I think following the news coming out of Armenia and Artsakh, there's a tendency that we often come away feeling negative and powerless. It seems there's these larger processes always taking place that we as a diaspora, we as a people are unable to control and to prevent from happening. But I want to ask, and this is an open question for all of the panelists, what are some of the silver linings today? Where can we look to feel more optimistic and constructive? And what can we as Armenian students and diasporans really do to get involved in this struggle?
I guess I can volunteer an answer. Well, the silver lining probably is that when something like this happens, when we find ourselves in crisis, which, dear Lord, has been going on far too often and far too frequently, one side of our collective identity always comes to the fore, that we do not abandon ship. If we're going to sink, we're going to sink. But we also try to dig up some collective wisdom that has been accumulated throughout history throughout our experiences, and we try to sort of, though I should premise this on the fact that as far as learning from history, Armenians, I think, a C student. We have not been an A student. We learn just enough to survive and wing it, like Simon was saying. But at least we have learned some things, and we have sort of developed these enormous resources of resilience that gives us so much hope and gives us so much to look forward. And I think that's one of the silver linings. I mean, in my lifetime, I never thought after the 1930s, I mean, after the 1990s, you know, I come from Gyumri and I suffered through the earthquake and we were homeless for a bit. And then in the midst of all of that, we were able to pull off this David Goliath dynamic and win the war, right? A war that was thrust upon us, but from which we came out victorious nonetheless. So that is sort of the silver lining that I see, that we come close to giving up, but we don't, and it frustrates our ill wishers. But it also gives us this other more proactive vision, and I think this is one of those situations that we that we can build upon this enormous goodwill that exists in our community, despite our differences and despite our the mistakes of our government. We sort of are able to rally around something, and that something being our culture and our identity and our language, and in some instances our faith. So that I see the silver lining in that. And what we can do, usually I am a bad tactical thinker. I offer bad prescription for a problem at hand. I think long term. One of my favorite phrases in French is longue durée, and a long duration. I like to think way past in the past, and I like to think way ahead. And so I think one of the things that we need to be thinking is more along those strategic lines. Your students go into good graduate programs, stay active, you do your advocacy, but at the same time, think about the future. Go into great graduate programs, lay that foundations, and carry on a scholarship that that is so essential in preserving our culture. That's why I admire people like Christina, I admire people like Simon, and I admire people like Harach Chilingirian and all of these great giants in Armenian studies. Nina Garsoya, I can give you names upon names. That these are the people that I look up to, and these are the people that have done their utmost. Because on some level we are crazy. I always say, you must be crazy to go into the Armenian studies field, because the funding is so limited and it's so niche on so many levels. But it also takes this craziness and this dedication to channel your talent, to channel your vision, and to do something that is going to last for a very long time. And so that is sort of my wish for your generation, guys, to be, to look these giants and to know that they are available to stand on their shoulders, and just dedicate yourselves to it and go forward with it. If I'm saying anything positive, that should be it.
That was great. I feel better too, Artyom. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Christina.
But I think, this was when the war broke out, I think I went through the gamut of emotions and everything. And I think it was a good time to train the response of, and this gets to what Artyom was saying, of just, okay, how am I going to respond? And my usual response is to work. I work my way through things. So I'll write, I'll work, that's the way I do things. But I've noticed, in the past 2 years now, the way the Armenian community has come together has been extraordinary. I have seen groups, whether it's the law, whether it's the church, whether it's academics, whether it's journalism. I've just seen I've met some of the smartest people I've ever met, So there's so much to admire in, you know, our people. There's so much to admire, and I think that the pain that we're going through, if we can do something, sort of turn it into something where we're teaching. You know, one thing I do in my classes is I don't shy away from talking about this. And I let my students know. And for students your age, this resonates. The idea of, you know, hatred, you know, what that looks like. And what it looks like when nobody cares. You know, they get it. And you get it. And so I find that I can communicate with them in a way that makes a connection between us. And that's very useful, and it's very powerful. And I think also, you know, it makes us understand as Armenians the fragility of our culture. We must understand it. It's not enough to say, oh, it's a pretty khachkar. We really need to there's so much to learn. So, you know, I think one thing I would say in terms of what to do, you know, each one of you has something or more than one thing that you love to do, that you're good at doing, whether it's engineering or whether it's dance or whatever it might be, or it's history or art history. You know, bring that to this. You can, you know, sort of apply those skills, those talents to make some changes in the way the world sees Artsakh. You can do that. So that's something that, and that way you know, you're refining a skill, you're getting better at something you're already good at. And that can be really powerful too. So, you know, I think this is the time to kind of put your skills to work, put your talents and your knowledge to work, and make it something you love too. That's really important. So, yeah.
If I may be that boring person that repeats the previous scholars or speakers, I just want to underline the common thread in what Dr. Tonoyan and Dr. Maranci said, which I'll use, you know, I'll paraphrase them, but it's really be your best, whether as a student, as a friend, as a professional, as a community member, in anything that you are doing, be your best, because that ultimately not only benefits you, but it benefits your community and benefits your homeland. I mean, for those of you who are in LA, I mean, that might not be as obvious because you have strong Armenian institutions. So many people are doing so many things, but it's so much more obvious in places like Denver, Minnesota, etc. I'll give you an example. In Denver, we had a pretty good, and we still have a very good and actually a great leader in the person who right now is leading our Armenians of Colorado organization. And, you know, he's managed to bring people together. Of course, always gives me the credit for recruiting him to lead this, but having him, like, during the war made such a huge difference. And the work that the teamwork he had done and others in the community had done. We're a tiny community. We raised like $300,000 for you know, the war effort. I know it feels like it was all for nothing because we lost the war, and that money didn't come from millionaires. It came from people who were making just enough income to get by, but they made huge sacrifices, and that would not have been possible if you did not have great community organizing. And you know, and so being really good at what at you do, being the best version of yourself, is going to help you, and it's ultimately going to help the community. And to have a strong homeland, we do need stronger diaspora organizations. I know it's counterintuitive because the diasporas are, you know, often at the cost of depleting the homeland, and we have to somehow find a way to reverse that, because diaspora's life, you know, has an expiration date. But ultimately, if we want to have a strong homeland, if we want to help Armenia and Artsakh, we need to have the best community organizing, the best institutions that we can have. And that means being the best versions of ourselves as individuals, regardless, as Christina said, in the field that you go. You know, you can be an engineer, you can be a doctor, you can be a carpenter, so long as you are, you know, the best version of yourself. I think we'll have a great future. And your mere presence and organizing of this and spending your Sunday evening and night, I think, is a testament to that.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your really thoughtful and, quite frankly, inspirational responses. Now we'll be accepting some questions from the audience for our Q&A segment. I want to be mindful of time, but if you have any questions, you can either use the chat function to leave your questions and I will address them to the panelists, or you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom and I will call on you to unmute and ask the question directly. We have one hand up. Hi, John. Go ahead and unmute and ask.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. This question isn't exactly about Armenian cultural destruction. However, it is about Armenian culture and art. It's more so directed to Professor Maranci. So just through my personal observations of various monuments, usually churches, I've seen the Armenian eternity symbol or the sun cross, the Arabahach. And that's like associated usually with pre-Christian culture as a pre-Christian symbol. However, interestingly, I've only ever seen it on churches, so Christian monuments, and never on anything else that's been like deemed as pre-Christian or let's say Armenian pagan, for example. However, I've seen like other things like the solar disk. So I was wondering if you could kind of explain why that is.
That's a great question. Thank you, Haig. Actually, the funny thing is, one of my students just gave a presentation on Jews in medieval Armenia, and on one of the tombstones in the Jewish cemetery in Yekakits, there are those. I just noticed them. This was literally like last week, and I thought, oh, I hadn't seen that before. So they're on these Jewish tombstones from medieval Jewish cemetery in Armenia. So there you go. That's not necessarily pre-Christian, but it's it's a different faith. But this community residing in Armenia. It's a really interesting question. And when we get to these kinds of, so everybody's familiar with these kinds of whorls, they're called sometimes, these kind of spiral forms that Haig is speaking about. And one of the problems with interpreting them, which isn't necessarily what you asked, but I will just address this. One of the problems with interpreting them is that what we want ideally to find is a medieval source, a medieval written source that speaks about them. And those are hard to come by. I wish that we had a kind of pattern book that said what everything meant. We don't have that, which makes it really interesting. So it may be intuitive that we think about a kind of a circle with a spiral as a kind of eternity sign, but how it was understood is probably a more complicated question. So there's that. So these are very interesting. They certainly show up a lot on monuments and probably had meaning. But also we see them sometimes on khachkars, but slightly different. So, but how we are to understand that, now that's a good, that might be a good project, right? To really kind of catalog them. Where do they appear in connection to what? Next to portals, next to inscriptions, next to other kinds of images. That might be really interesting to do. The first thing I would want to do is do even a deeper or broader look and see where else they appear in neighboring cultures as well. So wonderful question. I hope that was something like an answer for you.
Yeah, it was pretty informative.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Again, feel free to either leave them in the chat or raise your hand. Martin, I see your hand is up.
Hello, everyone. I apologize for the noise, but hopefully you can all hear me, right? Okay, perfect. Just a quick introduction. I'm the vice chair of All-Armenian Student Association. I would like to thank you all, dear panelists, for taking time off your Sunday and coming to give us your perspectives on a lot of important issues. And my question is specifically for Dr. Tonoyan and the book that you brought, and I would like you to kind of quickly, if possible, kind of highlight what, in your opinion, would the most stark difference between the narratives in the Russian media about the conflict and in the Western media would be. I also closely follow the Russian media because I speak Russian, but I would like to see your expert opinion on that. What's the number one thing that you could pinpoint and say this is the main narrative difference that you see?
in terms of narrative difference, there isn't much really. Journalists usually try to be journalists with, let's say, the proper journalistic bona fides that really are committed to their profession and are not shilling. They usually try to be above the fray and cover the issues with some objectivity. Now, with the Soviet Union, that was not the main issue. The main issue in the Soviet press was to reflect the accepted orthodoxy of the government on the issue. And the accepted orthodoxy of the government on the issue at the beginning of the conflict was that the conflict is unjust to the Armenian and Azeri peoples, but there is a problem in Nagorno-Karabakh. The problem can be solved, and the way to solve the problem is to keep Nagorno-Karabakh the status quo, but also to invest lots of money, because the Soviet government, as with many governments, look at problems as economic, and they discount any sort of cultural grievances or ethnic grievances that can exist. So a government that has a hammer in its hand looks at everything like a nail. And in the Soviet era, the coverage of the press was to reflect that ideology. Number one, you couldn't touch certain issues. You couldn't touch the issues of Armenia's cultural grievances, Armenia's ethnic grievances, discriminations, and so on and so forth. They were looking at it sort of an economic problem, and the best way to solve the problem is to throw money at it. And that didn't work, because the grievances continued, and then the grievances turned into reprisals against the Armenians and so on and so forth. But when you move into the Russian era, where now you have, you do not have these government strictures on how to cover the conflict, there were a couple of sort of ways the conflict was covered. Number one, what you see emerging in the post-Soviet Russian era of the coverage is more conservative-minded journalism and more liberal-minded journalism. And the more conservative-minded journalism was almost absolutely and almost at all times beholden to the Russian government's position on the conflict. They almost were stenographers. There was not much deep journalism done that entertained or investigated the issues, but how the Russian government viewed this conflict. And the Russian government at the time viewed the conflict in a sense, this imperial arbitrator who, because everybody else is failing, has been asked to come and to help these two Asiatic, almost non-civilized peoples to sort out the conflict. Russia was this referee that came into the ring and tried to keep the kids at bay and impose some sort of a solution. So it was very hubristic, very imperialistic, and so on and so forth. But the liberal coverage was much different. The liberal coverage was much pro-Armenian most of the time, because the Russian liberals at the time were looking at the plight of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. Even the liberals during the Soviet Union, they were looking at the plight of the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh as ultimately human rights issue, ultimately the issue of the Armenians, their cultural rights, their ability to preserve their culture and to thrive with it and along it. So they were looking at it as through that prism, and Azerbaijan was seen as this oppressive regime, which it was, which could care less about its religious and ethnic and cultural minorities, so on and so forth. But what the Russian press and the Soviet press, how they differed, was not sort of bringing any new angle to the interpretation of the conflict, but how much of it was done and how extensive it was done. Extensive to the degree that if you went through the Russian papers, you can almost reconstruct the conflict on a day-to-day basis, how it emerged, how it developed, where it was going, and where we ended up. Whereas if you look at the Western press, it's more like blips on the radar. The amount you cannot just compare. Whereas the Russians were thoroughly, ensconced in the conflict, and their journalism and their networks and their contacts with government officials, their interviews with local peoples and so on and so forth, incomparable. So that is sort of the advantage of the Russian press coverage, is that you get to see. I like how Ron Suni, when he wrote the endorsement to the book, is that you get to almost experience the emotions of the people going through the war, because there is always sort of a Russian journalist with a microphone interviewing someone and trying to get their opinion and so on and so forth. And this happens week in and week out, whereas with the Western press coverage, that's pretty much absent. Again, somebody shows up, stays there for a week, writes one or two dispatches, and is back in New York or London or Brussels, and he's gone. And he will never show up there. Or most of the other times you had, stringers or freelancers who just show up because, they're trying to build a career, write a story, and move on. And they put it on their resume when they apply to a job at, Associated Press or something. Oh, we were in Karabakh during the war. But what did you see? Oh, we saw this and that, and that was the extent of it. Whereas with the Russian and the Soviet press coverage, it was much, much different in that way. I hope I gave some sensible answer.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Our final question, again, want to be mindful of time. This is more of an open one. I just received it in the chat from Gevi, and the question goes as follows. Although there is hope within the diaspora community and subgroups who choose to involve themselves, such as ours currently, what worries or issues are there within the diasporan mentality that we should be aware of currently and moving forward? That's an open question.
Simon John?
Yeah, it's you.
Well, this is the area where there's, so much can be said, but a lot of it is, a self reflection. But I don't know if it would be fair. I've been involved with a lot of organizations, so I don't know if it would be, fair to be very specific. But I think that we sometimes, and this is not maybe just the diaspora, and this goes something I think to what Dr. Maranci said earlier. It doesn't go directly to what she said, but I think, there was an illusion of, when Azerbaijan talks about Caucasian Albanians and that history can only be understood through our Armenians. The way I interpreted that, and maybe I'm wrong, is that sometimes we try to mirror the frameworking of Azerbaijan and Turkey in terms of the way we say things, the way we do things, and especially after this war that we lost, I think there's this false perception that, if we were just like them, then, we would have won. And I think particularly the way we think of history reflects that. I know I'm not, I'm kind of evading the question only because I think, this kind of illustrates the larger point. Azerbaijanis talk about Caucasian Albanians as their ancestors, and we all of a sudden try to separate Caucasian Albanians from Armenians, even though they basically became Armenian, and they became part of Armenian culture, including in Artsakh. And that's a choice that other Christians and non-Christians have made throughout Armenian histories. A lot of Jews, a lot of Assyrians. Even today, I think you see that in the Assyrian community in Los Angeles. A lot of them, if they're intermarried, they choose to become Armenian because they have a better chance of surviving as an Armenian in the long term, as a Christian, as being part of the Armenian community. So I think it's very important for us not to fall for the framing of, this fascist dictatorships. Just because they were successful on the field doesn't mean that the way they do things, their propaganda, is the right way to go about this. Doesn't mean that we should become more sort of simple-minded. I think on the contrary, we need to expand our horizons even more because of that, and never be afraid of history, never be afraid of truth, never be afraid of self-criticism. And I think there's a lot of soul-searching and reflection to be done on that in scholarships, in community organizing, in other spheres of Armenian life. And I'm going to leave it there, in part because my wife keeps texting me. I think I need to pick her and our 2-year-old up from the in-laws. So if you would please excuse me, I'm going to have to leave now. But thank you so much for this amazing opportunity.
Thank you so much,
Thank you, Simon.
everybody.
Thank you.
We're going to wrap here today. Thank you so much first to our esteemed panelists for joining us. It was really an honor and a privilege to host you. So on behalf of All-ASA, we have some members of our executive board present. We have, me, Martin, Anna Ramazyan, and Lucin Yengibarian here. So thank you so much. And to everybody who attended, I know it's a Sunday. It's almost finals week. Some people still have midterms and exams that they're working on. Thank you so much for attending today. The recording will be posted on our YouTube page in the coming days. But thank you all for joining in this conversation and having this discussion. And have a great evening, and good night to all of the East Coast folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mahirja.